The next in vivo data set I'd like to discuss is very similar to the Tirzepatide combination study that we recently highlighted. This one, though, incorporates a few extra groups that help us interpret even further the mechanistic details that underpin nimacimab's efficacy. This study importantly includes not only nimacimab and tirzepatide at both a low and a high, a suboptimal and optimal dose, but also looks now at the combination of nimacimab and tirzepatide at both of these ranges. So we're understanding now how the low dose of tirzepatide as well as the higher dose of tirzepatide may combine with nimacimab. The other key group in this study was the pair-fed control group. We used the same caloric output of the nimacimab cohort to feed the pair-fed group such that these mice had exact match calorie to calorie of the nimacimab group. This allows us to understand any additional efficacy gains beyond caloric input. Now, as we look through both the absolute weight and the vehicle-adjusted weight loss on slide 2, we can see, in fact, that the pair-fed group, while very similar initially to the weight loss curve of nimacimab, quickly reaches an equilibrium and eventually puts back on some weight. This occurs by about day 15, day 12, and ultimately we see a very similar weight loss as the vehicle adjusted. This is in stark contrast to nimacimab, which was able to achieve about 18 and 19% weight loss by day 25. And again, very similar to the previous study, we see that the lower dose of tirzepatide, and again, it's the same 3 nanomole per kg daily, is able to achieve about a 25% weight loss, whereas the more optimal dose, the 10 nanomole per kg daily of tirzepatide, is achieving about a 35%. Also, similar to the previous study, we see that the combination of the low dose of tirzepatide with nimacimab is able to have a strong additive effect, achieving about 39% weight loss. And importantly, we see additional gains when combining nimacimab with the higher, more optimal dose of tirzepatide, achieving 46.6, almost 47% weight loss, which is an astounding amount of weight loss achieved, and speaks to the ability to not only that these are separate pathways, but these can be driven ultimately to a really substantial amount of weight loss. And of course, this all has translational relevance. The key point here is, again, this ability to combine with the incretins across various doses. And so you can imagine the different clinical applications across. Importantly, just underscoring that mechanistically, the reduction in calories, the anorexigenic drivers that nimacimab is able to promote, likely through hormone regulation that we've described in the pillars, this is not the only piece of the puzzle. There are other metabolic gains that are occurring, which also have been highlighted in that pillars talk, the mechanistic pillars talk. We think, again, this coordinated effort allows for more than just reduced calories as being the driver of weight gain, and the pair-fed group helps establish that. Similar to the previous experiment, we ran this study in a phase A and a phase B. If you go to the next slide, we can see what happens as we remove the drug and we move into the phase B to assess rebound. Similar to the previous study, the last dose of nimacimab was actually administered on day 22. So by day 25, we know based on our PK work that there should be minimal to no meaningful amounts of nimacimab in these mice. And just as a quick aside, the half-life of nimacimab in the mice is very different than the human. The human, of course, is 19 to 22 days, as we talked about previously. And in the mice, likely due to the lack of FcRn, the neonatal receptor, a lack of binding to the antibody and recycling dynamics, we have a very quick clearance of the antibody. Terminal half-life is about 3 days with initial half-life less than 24 hours. So we see a very, very short half-life. And in fact, we need to use larger doses to get translatable exposure, something that's in line with our clinical doses. as a quick aside, allows us to look at the rebound kinetics. Now, this is early data. This study is still underway, but we can see, even with that caveat, and this is sort of, again, ongoing study, we can see that the pair-fed group has really achieved almost the same amount, maybe even going beyond the DIO, the control mice, and has achieved more weight loss. Whereas the nimacimab group, similar to seen before, is maintaining this weight loss. So we're not seeing any real change in the weight loss as the drug is removed. And you can see there's about a 20% difference now in weight loss between the pair-fed group and nimacimab. Again, this phenomenon of weight loss is not simply relating to modulation of calories. It's not the only driver. So this helps, I think, put that into contrast. Now, the other piece that we want to speak to is the idea of rebound, not only in terms of the pair-fed group, but looking at the tirzepatide groups. And so the next slide highlights both the low dose and the high dose of tirzepatide's rebound. This is, again, early data, but we're seeing a very similar curve to what was done previously, and others have shown there's a large body of evidence that talks about the rebound kinetics. We can see already that in that first week that the low dose of tirzepatide is already put back on much more weight than nimacimab, and you can see that the high dose of tirzepatide is almost on top of nimacimab at this early time point. We still again, have a long way to go with phase B out to day 48. So we'll see where both the low and high dose tirzepatide ultimately rebound, but we expect this maintenance to maintain as demonstrated previously, and the tirzepatides groups to have a more notable weight gain through this rebound phase. If we now switch and look at the maintenance concept with nimacimab, again, early data, but we can see that the maintenance is particularly evident in the low dose of tirzepatide. So we're highlighting here on the next slide the rebound curve as shown previously. And in the light blue filled circles, you can see nimacimab providing meaningful maintenance. And this is occurring to a lesser extent with the high dose of tirzepatide. But in both instances, we're seeing that nimacimab is able to provide a meaningful maintenance therapeutic. We will be following this out again as we complete the phase B, but the early data suggests that, like the previous study, nimacimab will be able to provide meaningful maintenance, likely both at a high and low dose of tirzepatide. When looking at the echo MRI endpoint, this helps us understand the contribution of fat mass and lean mass. We can see a very similar pattern that has been described in our previous study, whereby the predominant driver of this weight loss appears to be fat mass, and the nimacimab group is able to achieve meaningful weight loss, but not to the same extent as the incretin. And the incretins, in fact, are not able to achieve the same level as the combination of nimacimab with tirzepatide in this instance. So fat mass at the end of phase A appears to be a predominant driver, and we're able to achieve greater fat mass when used in combination. Lean mass, while there is some movement, appears to be, again, a bit more modest, where fat mass seems to be the predominant driver, and this is in line with previous studies. When we look at the food intake, we see a similar pattern as demonstrated previously in the tirzepatide combo study discussed earlier. That is, the food intake is in sharp contrast over the first 5 days, with the incretins demonstrating a sharp decrease in the amount of food, whereas nimacimab takes a bit of time before we see the reduction in food intake. There seems to be a bit of overlap as we move into the latter phase, that's day 15 to day 25, where the groups achieve a similar amount of daily food intake throughout that phase A, latter portion. As we look at the initial daily food intake in phase A, similar to the previous study, we see there's a sharp reduction in the amount of calories with the incretins. And this is very different than nimacimab, which really doesn't have the reduction in daily food intake till about day 5. And this is pretty stable throughout the remaining portion of phase A, whereas the incretin, again, have that sort of reduction initially, and ultimately we see that these patterns converge by about day 20 in the phase A. When we look at the cumulative food intake over this phase A, this is graphed on the right, we can see that there's clearly a difference between the amount of cumulative food intake with nimacimab versus the other groups, whether incretins alone or in combination. So certainly less of an anorexigenic effect with nimacimab relative to the incretins. However, it's worth highlighting that the reduction in caloric intake is certainly evident in combination, particularly with the low dose, that's the orange group of tirzepatide. As you get to the high dose of tirzepatide in red, there's less of a benefit. The ultimate cumulative food intake is fairly similar with the red and purple group, while the cumulative food intake is not significantly different between the high tirzepatide and the combo tirzepatide. The weight is suggesting there may be additional benefits beyond calories in terms of translation to weight loss or absolute weight. And we think that might relate again to lipid metabolism, may relate to other energy expenditure concepts, and these are again detailed in our pillars conversation. Lastly, as we look at the phase B data, and this is early data, so difficult to make any hard conclusions, but we are seeing similar patterns, at least initially, as to what we saw previously, and that is that the incretins tend to have a larger rebound in terms of that food intake, with the nimacimab remaining more stable. We will have to see as phase B completes what happens ultimately to the fat mass and to the caloric intake, but it appears again that nimacimab is looking a bit more stable in terms of this food intake, and that the incretins are increasing both the food intake, and we believe that fat mass should follow suit. Collectively, this study left us with some very interesting observations. Importantly, I would highlight that the pair-fed group helped solidify that the reduction in caloric intake driven by nimacimab is not the key driver to weight loss. Certainly an important piece, but the pair-fed group highlights that likely other mechanisms that nimacimab is able to trigger yields important metabolic changes and ultimately a more robust weight loss. So going beyond caloric restriction as a driver. The study also details that the additive effects we noted previously when combining nimacimab with low-dose tirzepatide also translate to the more optimal high dose of tirzepatide, and that this combination now can occur at both doses, suggesting that these orthogonal mechanisms can be applied irrespective of incretin dose. And this, of course, leaves a lot of translational tools as we think about its application in the clinic. And while early, this study also demonstrates that the phase B, the either maintenance and or rebound phase of the study, will allow for a very stable maintenance of weight loss through nimacimab. We believe this data is already starting to demonstrate that, and that the maintenance when switching from tirzepatide to nimacimab also appears to be relevant. Now, this is early data. We will update these slides as soon as we have the data, but we believe that the patterns are already setting up and likely will hold true. When thinking about the body composition as it relates to fat mass and relatedly food intake, certainly nimacimab is able to drive both fat mass loss and stable fat mass loss beyond treatment. So in that treatment withdrawal period, we believe this to be a key element in terms of its maintenance. And while there is reduction in food intake and certainly a key driver of weight loss, we think the mechanisms at play go beyond anorexigenic drivers. And this, again, is part of the more interrelated and supportive mechanisms that have been detailed in our pillars conversation. But ultimately, this allows for more robust and orthogonal mechanisms relative to many AOMs currently dominating the obesity landscape. And ultimately, we believe this will translate to a very safe therapeutic.